Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Resolution Foundation. We're here to talk about social care today. My name is Naya Comenetti. I'm a principal economist at Resolution Foundation. I should say normally in this seat you would have Ruth, our chief executive, talking to you, but our entire senior leadership team are at an away day today, mulling over big questions like what should our research plan be for 2026 and just how many chandeliers is it appropriate for a living standards think tank to have? Hopefully the answer is 2, because that's how many we've got, I think. So you've got me, and we have a really important question to answer today, which is how can a fair pay agreement improve conditions for social care staff? I think that's an important question, and it's an important report that Charlie, Hannah and Mel have written for a few reasons. One is social care is a very big sector, so if we think good work matters in a broad sense, we really need to make social care jobs good jobs. There are 1.5 million people in that sector. Secondly, introducing this agreement I think is one of the biggest things the government is doing, and we've learned already that not everything the government says it wants to do, it manages to do, so I think thinking through the detail, learning lessons from abroad is really important, and that's definitely what the report does. And then thirdly, I think you could give a broad characterization, which is that the way the UK has tried to improve pay and conditions over the last generation really is to kind of nudge up the floor. So we have the minimum wage and now we have the Employment Rights Bill. But I would say we've kind of lacked ideas of how to drive improvements in other ways, so for people above that floor. So I think this could be, you know, if successful, could be a really important innovation and maybe allow us to make some of those broader improvements. So to help us do that, we have a fantastic panel. We have Charlie McCurdy, who is an economist at Resolution Foundation and one of the authors of the report. We have Nehal Davison, a program director at the Institute for Government, and who knows something about how all this went in New Zealand. So I'm really looking forward to that. We have Gavin Edwards over on my left, who's the head of social care at Unison, which is the largest union in the sector. And we have Joyce Pinfield on my left, who is the vice chair of the National Care Association and also used to run a care home. Is that correct?
Yes, I used to be a provider until last year.
Very good. Okay, so before we make a start, you need to know about Slido. So if you want to take part in the room, you can just put your hand up and ask a question in the traditional way. Do you have feelings about Slido you want to? But for everyone online, and I'm assured that about half the health department is online, which is great. You can take part in Slido, you can ask questions, and then there will be a poll at some point. And there is a hashtag available for you to use, which is taking care. But hopefully there's some information about Slido. Hopefully you've all figured out how to get on that, and certainly online I think that should be more obvious to you. Okay, that's enough preamble. Charlie, do you want to give us your overview of the paper?
Yep, great. Thanks very much, Nye. And I also wanted to start by saying thanks to my co-authors who are sitting in here, Melanie Sims from Glasgow University and Hannah Slaughter here from the Foundation. I guess I just wanted to kick off by giving some kind of context for the world of work of care workers. As Naya has sort of already mentioned, it's a really important service that they deliver. The kind of work that they do can be really high stakes. It can also be immensely rewarding for care workers themselves. And I just wanted to give a few quotes from a focus group the Resolution Foundation ran with care workers a few years ago that really makes these points very clear. Now, the first is from a home care worker, so those who sort of go into people's homes, and the quote basically says, on the wards, only nurses are allowed to administer medications, but carers who have been there only 2 weeks with minimal training are meant to do that. So that just sort of gives a sense of the high stakes nature of their work. This next quote is from a care home worker where they said, it is rewarding, you create good relationships. I like hearing my clients' life stories. You create lifelong friends. It's a caring job. So this just sort of gives a sense of the high stakes and often rewarding nature of the work. Unfortunately, the rewarding and important nature of the work is not matched by the poor quality of work on offer to care workers. This chart just shows a bunch of sort of different measures of poor quality work for care workers and other low paid jobs. We can see that around about half of care workers say they always or often come home exhausted. Roughly 2/3 say that they work under a great deal of tension. I could have sort of chosen from a whole long list of different measures. You can see that one on the right-hand side of the slide. The average pay for frontline carers is just 79p above the minimum wage. All of which is contributing to the recruitment and retention crisis. I guess with all of that in mind, this is basically we see as a sort of once in a generation opportunity to turn things round. It's really welcome that the government is creating the adult social care negotiation body that will draw up a fair pay agreement to improve conditions in the sector. Now there are some really sort of tricky policy design questions like who should be at the negotiating table and which terms and conditions should be covered. But as the short life of New Zealand's own fair pay agreements demonstrates, this process needs to happen quite quickly. So in New Zealand, the fair pay agreements basically struggled to get off the ground. There was lots of business opposition. We'll hear more from this a bit later. And in general, our argument is that very much this should be done with sort of speed and simplicity, testing what works as we go through the process. So with all of that in mind, I'm going to take you through our recommendations to help get the fair pay agreement off the ground. I should start by saying that the government has sort of set a framework. There are some details that we are familiar with. For example, who is actually going to be around the table. We know there are going to be worker representatives. We know there's going to be an independent chair. We don't know who that is yet. And we know that there's going to be employer representatives around the table with the Care Provider Alliance coordinating. Our sort of argument in the report, though, is that worker and employer representatives should be required to consult more widely to ensure that the fair pay agreement represents the diverse voices of the sector. I guess this is sort of two key reasons. The first, from a worker perspective, we know that union membership is low in the care sector. This is especially the case for marginalised groups, zero-hours contract workers and migrant workers. And from an employer perspective, the social care sector has a really sort of diverse nature of providers, from family-run businesses to care homes, so to providers with 200 plus care homes. We also think there should be space for other groups to be involved. So who else do we think could be sort of involved in the negotiating process? We think there's a role for an organisation like ACAST to help with employer coordination and help establish the body quite quickly. We also think we agree with the government, there's a special role for local government in the negotiating process, given their role as a commissioner of social care services. And we also expect external experts to be involved, and this is the kind of thing that already happens with the Low Pay Commission today. Now, the government has also said that the agreement could potentially cover all workers in the sector, so including cooks and cleaners. We think that the fair pay agreement should initially focus on frontline carers in the private sector, who are generally those who are at the sharp end in terms of poor pay and conditions. We also think that with most aspects of employment law, it would be reasonable to start with employees and workers. It might feel a bit odd telling self-employed workers to increase their own wages, but we think there should be scope to include the self-employed a bit later on down the line. Finally, we think that agency workers should be included, and this would avoid creating a kind of two-tiered system between those people who are essentially doing the same work. Sort of next question, policy design question that we consider, which is arguably the most consequential in terms of driving up conditions in the sector, is which terms and conditions should actually be in the agreement. And we've proposed a framework to help sort of speed up this process. it should be guided by answering the following 5 questions, which are: which issues do workers themselves care about? Is the issue contributing to the staffing crisis? Does it necessitate collective action? Will it be addressed by some other element of the Employment Rights Bill? And how have other countries successfully got sector deals off the ground? In the spirit of sort of getting my presentation done on the time, I'm only going to talk through the sort of core priorities that drive our recommendations. To start with, we know that care workers aren't happy with their pay. This chart just shows you the share of care workers who say they're satisfied with their pay, which I think we can sort of interpret as something a bit like their hourly wage, has fallen from around 7 in 10 in 1992 to around half today, and you can see there hasn't been quite the sort of market change in other occupations. Now, why might this be the case? We know that the pay premium for care workers has fallen over time, so their pay relative to other low-paid occupations has fallen. We also know there is a very flat pay structure in the care sector, so in general, sort of years of experience and seniority are generally not financially rewarded. And finally, many home carers, so those who do lots of visits, are likely underpaid when we factor in the amount of travel time that they do. It's worth also saying that poor pay is contributing to the recruitment and retention crisis. This chart just shows you the share of social care providers who report that the main cause of staff leaving, so that's on the left side, is better pay outside of the sector. And it also shows you that the main difficulty for social care providers finding new staff is also better pay outside the sector. I guess the question then becomes, well, what could the government do? Our sort of starting point is that more could be done to ensure home carers aren't underpaid when we factor travel time in. This is sort of first and foremost an enforcement issue. The other thing that the government could do is sort of consider pay structures. There's lots of different examples to draw on. There's very sort of clearly delineated pay spines in the NHS. And there's also other countries with sector deals in Ireland and Australia that have sort of similar things up and running. We also think that there is a sort of very clear collective action rationale for including training in the Fair Pay Agreement. Over half of care workers lack a relevant social care qualification. This is obviously bad from a quality of care perspective if many workers lack the sort of basic skills to do their job properly. There's also a really long history of sector partnerships designed to upskill current and future workforces. This is at sort of home in industries like construction, but also abroad. And in general, we think embedding sector-wide training raises standards and reduces the risk for individual employers who train their staff. And now the sort of final design question before wrapping up, how should the Fair Pay Agreement be enforced, so ensuring that it has a sort of legal teeth to do its job properly. This chart just shows you that around about 21,000 care workers were underpaid. And in general, it's very welcome to see that the pay elements of the Fair Pay Agreement will be enforced by the Fair Work Agency, which will be the sort of single enforcement body for enforcing employment rights. We think that there are other areas which should be brought into scope where there is a sort of clear-cut distinction between compliance and non-compliance. So if there was sort of minimum standards around training, training could be brought into scope too. I'll just sort of wrap up now. The government, has rightly recognised that the value carers provide to society isn't matched by their poor pay and working conditions. The details are obviously really important. Making sure that the body represents the diverse voices of the sector and also that it's enforced properly. But our argument is very much this should be done in the spirit of pragmatism, as the short life of New Zealand's Fair Pay Agreements demonstrates, which never got off the ground. If we get this right, this could become a really viable model for other sectors with really big labour market problems like warehousing and cleaning. If we get this wrong, we might have to wait another generation for innovation of this scale to re-emerge. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Charlie. As Charlie mentioned, New Zealand tried this and does not currently have a fair pay agreement in social care, so there's a very, very useful cautionary tale there. So now I think you might be able to tell us a few things about what happened in New Zealand.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nai. So, I'll share some reflections on New Zealand's attempt to do something very similar. Just by way of disclaimer, I didn't work directly on fair pay agreements. I did work on a wider set of labour market reforms and policies, worked very closely with a team that eventually designed and repealed them. So I won't have the same level of policy detail, but hopefully can share a helpful perspective on kind of how that policy took shape, how it kind of landed in the New Zealand context and why it proved so challenging, and crucially what lessons the UK might draw. So starting with a bit of context, fair pay agreements were part of a much broader labour market agenda that Jacinda Ardern's Labour government introduced when they came to power in 2017. They were trying to do a lot of things at the same time. So, for example, improving legal protections for low-paid contractors and gig workers, something that I kind of led, designing a new social unemployment insurance scheme for displaced workers, tackling migrant exploitation, strengthening the overall health and safety at work regime, and generally trying to raise the floor of minimum employment standards. So they were trying to do a lot, and FPAs was the government's flagship policy in this area, and took many years to develop. So work first started in early 2018 with a tripartite working group, and that brought together employers, unions, and labour market experts. And it took about 5 years to get to the point of legislation. So the legislation was first introduced in December 2022, so about 3 years ago now, and just repealed 1 year later when the new centre-right coalition government came to office. So as Charlie said, it had a very short life, and it's important to emphasise that although bargaining had actually started in some sectors, no pay settlements had ever been finalised. So it's actually really hard to share any details about kind of whether the model worked or not. But I will share some kind of key differences that I do think have some important lessons for the UK. So I think the UK has a relative advantage in that there is much broader agreement between employers and unions that something needs to be done about pay and conditions in the adult social care workforce. And that consensus didn't exist in New Zealand, and the framework ultimately, as I said, didn't survive a change in government. And there were many, many reasons for this, but I think the main reason was that the New Zealand's kind of model was very ambitious. So the framework wasn't confined to just social care. It was designed to apply to any sector across the entire economy. But the underlying problem that FPAs tried to address was much more contested. And so as Charlie said, FPAs did face very strong opposition from employers throughout the policymaking process. And Business New Zealand, so that's the main employer representative body, even tried to convince the ILO that the framework contravened Convention 98 around freedom of association, but they weren't successful in that. I think officials, for their part, really understood these risks and did highlight in their regulatory impact statement that there was a risk that the model kind of risk being applied too widely, even in sectors where there wasn't a clear labour market issue. So they instead kind of advocated a much more kind of targeted approach. So I think for the UK, there is a really important lesson here that even if there is agreement, roughly, on the problem today and the framework is confined to a specific sector, there's kind of no guarantee that that policy will survive a change in administration kind of later on. So we do know that implementation is expected kind of later down the line in 2028 or 9. So government really needs to think now about how it's going to build that cross-party consensus and how to reassure business that an agreement in adult social care won't kind of automatically kind of open the door to agreements in other sectors where there's less agreement on the fundamental kind of labour market issues. I do think that's particularly important given Labour's agenda in terms of kind of the Make Work Pay and the Employment Rights Bill. There's one New Zealand example of a policy that did survive a change in government that I think also offers a useful perspective here. So that was extension of collective bargaining to screen workers. That was also introduced around the same time as FPAs. And these are the people who work on the Lord of the Rings trilogy, for example. That succeeded because it was tightly scoped. There was much clearer agreement on the problem. So one of the interesting facts that some people won't know is that screen workers were carved out of the Employment Relations Act in 2010 in New Zealand because of lobbying from Peter Jackson, no less. Essentially, it was seen as there was clear agreement that something needed to be done to kind of restore kind of protections for this group, whilst not fully bringing them back into kind of the employment relations regime. So both sides were involved in designing something that felt workable and balanced worker protections with kind of flexibility that kind of the sector needed. And it did survive because it was targeted and there was much more consensus around that problem. So agree with what's been said today. I think starting small and being pragmatic is really critical. And if I bring it back closer to home, I think the national minimum wage is a really good example of a UK policy in the labour market that's really stuck because ministers made that case clearly, won the argument early and actively managed fears about unintended consequences. So I think the same groundwork will be needed here. I'm just going to finish by highlighting where New Zealand landed on coverage more broadly. So the original ambition was to include employees and contractors, partly because some of the lowest paid workers in New Zealand were kind of technically contractors. But after 2 years of trying to do something that kind of fit both categories of workers, it was just simply put in the kind of too difficult basket. So the system, like is being kind of suggested here, applied to employees only. I think it's important to highlight that this did leave a big gap in coverage for workers who arguably needed the most protections, especially those with very low bargaining powers, and something that unions particularly warned about was the risk of employers then seeing it as a bit of an incentive to downgrade employment status to avoid FPA obligations. So ministers did try and deal with this in a few different ways. So one of them was tasking me to figure out how to improve protections for all of those people that have been left out of the FPA system. And the other was actually finding out how contractors could be brought into the FPA system at a later date, which I know RF are recommending. I think it's important to emphasise that officials in their advice were very clear that contractors couldn't be half in. Either you design the system with them from the start, or you undertake a proper redesign later, because simply retrofitting them into the model that hadn't been designed wasn't considered workable. And that's partly because the model ended up being very specific and really meant that it couldn't really be, it wasn't flexible enough to accommodate contractors at a later stage. So I do know the UK is taking a similar approach, and I do think it is pragmatic and it makes sense, given it's important to get this off the ground quickly. But given how diverse the adult social care workforce is, it does raise, I think, an important question about how do you build a flexible model that can expand later, rather than investing heavily in a system that covers only part of a workforce and risk permanently excluding others. So I think the lesson I would end with is that pragmatism is essential, but it does have limits. So start small, helps you win the argument and builds consensus, but make sure you have enough flexibility in the system to kind of evolve over time as well.
Great, thank you very much. Do we do claps after? I can't remember. Why not? Spoke for a long time. That was all very interesting. We'll definitely come back to some of those questions about what went wrong and how the UK can avoid those pitfalls. Gavin, could you give us the perspective from the union? So you're already involved in this process to some extent, so it'd be great to know how that's going, whether you're optimistic about this process, whether you agree with Charlie's takes about, move quickly or risk not moving at all.
Yeah, thank you. I'm hugely optimistic because I think that's the way to get this done. I think to be positive about it, to be positive about a policy that several people have described in recent weeks. I've seen at least twice I've seen this quote, that this is the most radical policy that most people don't know about. And I think that's true. It's kind of flown under the radar a little bit. But if you consider that this is a policy that will apply to a huge sector that's comparable in size with the NHS, a sector that has deep-seated issues and problems with the treatment of its workforce, and that is a public service, then I think it really is radical. And I think it's important to restate that social care in this country is incredibly important to the population at large and is a public service. It's largely publicly funded, although obviously there are elements of it which are privately funded. And And as a modern country that wants to deal with some of the deep-seated issues that this country has, we have to make sure that social care works in this country, because we've got an ageing population, we've got increasing levels of need, and I think the Fair Pay Agreement is an absolutely crucial element of that. I mean, I think, let's start with just sketching out some of the problems. We've got care worker members who have very low core pay, either at or below national minimum wage. We've got members who are not being paid properly for their travel time if they're domiciliary care workers, something you've done work on previously, Nye. That is widespread. You have people doing 14-hour shifts and only getting paid 8 hours at minimum wage. That's completely unacceptable. It causes misery for them and their families. And this is not an isolated problem. This is something that's widespread and that affects many, many thousands of workers. Overnight sleep-in shifts are paid at far less than minimum wage. And we've seen in recent years totally unacceptable exploitation of the migrant care workers who've come to this country at the request of our government in order to help with the vacancy rates in the sector and provide social care. And that the treatment of that group of workers in particular has at times been even worse than the pretty low standards of the care sector that were already in place. So the Fair Pay Agreement is a great opportunity to turn this around. We've got a system really which incentivises all of the wrong things, where we have a race to the bottom on terms and conditions for the workforce, because everybody can always pass the buck. Providers can always say that the local councils are not commissioning at a good enough rate, which sometimes is true. The councils can always say the government's not giving them enough money, and the government can always say that, nobody is doing a good job, which is something that Boris Johnson did during the pandemic. And we need to stop that buck passing. I think the Fair Pay Agreement is a really important example of stopping that and saying, look, no more. We need to move on from this. I wanted to just say a little bit about the pitfalls and risks, because if you're going to be optimistic about something, you also have to be realistic about what the threats are to success. And I think one of the major ones that we would have been concerned about, but are no longer concerned about, is actually government commitment to this. And actually what I've seen in practice is very strong commitment from government, from ministers, from the Prime Minister to this particular policy. And that's also been reflected in the process that has been set out over the last 12 months, that's been supported by the civil servants at Department of Health and Social Care, which has brought together unions and employers in order to discuss the issues that we need to kind of shake out to make this successful. I've been very impressed with that process. I think it has produced, a kind of set of proposals that are now currently being consulted on. Doesn't mean that there aren't still issues that need to be faced, but I think they've made a good start. Poor enforcement, which was mentioned earlier, is clearly a huge risk. The answer to that is to properly resource the Fair Work Agency and to have a focused team working particularly on the social care fair pay agreement. You can see, because of the travel time is a great example of why enforcement is so important. Trade unions don't need to negotiate for people to be paid travel time because it's already unlawful. And yet, because we don't have proper enforcement in the care sector, that has fallen into disrepute. And we don't want the same thing to happen to the FPA, and we want to see these issues confronted. I think poor commissioning by councils is a big risk as well. If councils are not given very, very clear guidance on FPA compliant commissioning, then we're going to run into problems. So I think that needs to be thrown into the mix as well. Not funding the fair pay agreements sufficiently. The first set of funding we've been given is £500 million for the first fair pay agreement. That's not as much as we would have wanted. It's a significant amount of money, but it's not as much as we would have wanted. And we will expect as trade unions to see better funding for future fair pay agreements. Let's not forget, this isn't a 1-year issue. We're trying to build an institution of collective bargaining here. And, year one has got 500 million allocated to it. Let's hope that in subsequent years we see funding that meets the scale of the challenge. I do think that hostility to trade unions from some care employers is also a risk and an issue. I think that's something that has been mitigated somewhat by what's happened over the last 12 months, where we've been able to, at a national level, build more relationships between trade unions and employers. And it's been really good to see employers engaging more with trade unions. But the fact remains there are many organisations who are actively hostile towards trade unions. Only last week, one of our regional reps sent me an email exchange with a care employer, and they were simply making a very reasonable request to go and talk to some of the workers where we had significant membership, and the response came back, no, you can't come in. Right, and that's still happening, and that's still the norm in the care sector. Maybe later on we can talk a little bit about unionisation and union membership in the care sector, because I know that's part of what forms part of your report. Timeliness is clearly really important as well. This does need to happen as quickly as possible. And part of that comes with the momentum. The government set out a timetable at the moment. We would like to see that happen more quickly, but it does also give us the opportunity to build a robust institution for collective bargaining, which is what we're hoping to see. And then finally, on risks, I'd say avoidance of the application of the Fair Pay Agreement would be an issue. We don't want to see, through there being narrower coverage of the Fair Pay Agreement, certain elements of social care being kind of rocket boosters putting under it in order to avoid the outcomes of a Fair Pay Agreement. That's why we're arguing for as broad a possible application of the Fair Pay Agreement. I think that's like a really important element of it. I think this is a kind of a welcome contribution to the debate that's going on at the moment. I am optimistic about the delivery of a successful Fair Pay Agreement in 2028. There's a lot of hard work that needs to go in from both unions and employers before then, but let's move ahead and try and make that happen.
Okay, thank you very much, Karen. Okay, Joyce, so over to you. So you represent providers, have been a provider in the past yourself, so how do you think the government can make a success of this?
Well, it's been very well documented, I think, how difficult it's been in the social care sector for many years now. Myself, I'm National Care Association, who represents small and medium-sized providers of care, whether it's domiciliary care, care homes, nursing care. So we are at the sharp end of the independent sector. I myself have been in the sector and in care homes for over 25 years, so I've been there, I've been in the care homes on a daily basis and recognise the problems with obtaining staff and also the reputation of staff. This is one of the biggest things that we face, is the public perception of low-skilled, undervalued people, the last job you take if you can't get anything else. How are we going to change that perception with the public? That is our starting point, because, as Gavin has already mentioned, with an ageing population and also younger people getting more complex health requirements, we're going to need possibly up to 500,000 more carers within the next 10 years. So we need to change the perception of care around so that it is highly paid, recognise that it is skilled. Earlier we said about how unfortunately not many, the percentage of trained workforce is quite low. I believe it used to be quite higher, but of course we've had such a turnover in staff because of not valuing our carers. This has impacted on the training. I myself was putting people through training, and either they would drop out halfway through, I would train them up to senior levels, and then they might even go to the NHS because of course it's better pay, better terms and conditions. At the moment, we were, during the pandemic, we had over 160,000 vacancies. And then I think we called it the Boris wave with the sponsorship visas coming in. We did manage to reduce that vacancy level. However, have we been treating them properly? I do think that part of that system was definitely abused. We do know within National Care Association that And I myself at care shows have met people who have been brought into the country having been promised training and jobs, and when they got here they weren't offered anything. And under the visa system they could only work for those people who held their visa. So it would have been wonderful if those people could have been enabled to work for other providers who had vacancies, because they were already here, they were willing to work. Regarding fair pay, of course we want to pay our staff a fair wage. It's a very complex situation. I note that this will only start with the frontline carers. So will that impact on other people working within the care industry? We've already got a major problem with vacancies. In fact, this week I heard of a provider who advertised for a domestic position. 81 people applied for the job. Guess how many turned up for the interview? None. And this is a situation that we are getting, that people are actually applying for jobs but not turning up for the interviews. Why is this? Is it because it's social care? Is it because they think they've got a better offer somewhere else? What is the problem? How can we make social care attractive, even to domestics, maintenance people, activities people, not only the frontline workers who are being looked at under the Fair Pay Agreement? Then, of course, we come to the scope of it. Who is going to input into this consultation to actually work out where we're coming out at? We would like to see, of course, the NHS, the local authorities, everybody who commissions care. Where would people come? Because, of course, social care is a very difficult thing, because not many people realise how social care is funded. And it's often that people only discover this at a critical time in their lives, or for the families. Suddenly somebody needs hospital because and social care because of some accident, some medical or clinical condition. And it's a minefield to go through with the means testing, whether you're local authority funded, whether you can get NHS care, whether you're nursing, whether you're residential, where do you find a place to go? So we need to have the backup of all of those providers to ensure, because we are looking after people, and the people who are looking after those people who are so vulnerable need to be paid fairly for that job, because it is complex, it is difficult. You are facing people who possibly have dementias and other mental health abilities, so it's not a glamorous job. However, it is so rewarding that it needs to be valued, and we are giving people a quality of life. So where are we going to find these people from? Let's hope that we do get a fair pay agreement, but of course you can only pay wages if you're getting the income coming in. So at present, I forget the exact figures, it's something like 40% of people in care are local authority funded. So we need to get those funds through the commissioning practices to be able to fund this fair pay agreement. I myself, when I was a provider, my wages to fees, of course, was the wages bill was the biggest factor that I had. And of course, it each depends on how your financial setup is, whether you've got mortgages or how you set up the business in the first place. But I was getting on to 80% was my wages bill of my income. And then you have to think of everything else that we're trying to add on to be able to provide that service. And in domiciliary care, of course, that figure is much higher because they haven't got quite the overheads that a residential setting does have. So how are the local authorities and the other commissioning agents going to be able to afford to pay the correct amount to cover the fair pay agreement? Over the last few years, the national living wage has been going up quite significantly, but unfortunately the fee levels paid by local authorities hasn't often, in many cases, been going up by even half the amount of the national living wage increase. So this is why we do have such problems within the care sector, especially within those who are looking after funded residents. And of course, this would also impact on people who are paying privately. I've also heard recently this week about people who, providers who have local authority funded residents and NHS funded residents, but their private residents are actually paying double the amount they get from local authorities. Now, should we be allowing that to happen? They're getting the same care, they're getting the same facilities, but it has been going on for a very long time, and that gap is getting wider and wider, trying to fill the gap between the local authority rate and giving that good quality care to ensure the quality of life for that person. So this fair pay agreement does need to be looked at extremely carefully on the scope, who is taking part of it, how it will be implemented, and will it be properly funded.
Thank you very much, Joyce. Okay, so we heard some words of warning from New Zealand, some optimism from the union, and some, I think, a fairly clear message of where's the money coming from the provider side of it. So all really good perspectives. So we've got about half an hour left to have a discussion. My plan was to organise it in three parts. One, briefly, just remind ourselves of this, of the problem that the Fair Pay Agreement is trying to tackle. Then most of it, really about the detail of this and how it's likely to work. And then maybe a bit at the end, sort of stepping back and think, well, why are we doing this as opposed to something else, like, the government just unilaterally putting more money into the system, or, keeping on going with a liberal migration regime. So we've already got lots of questions coming in on Slido, so well done to all of you. I can see there's some anxious local authorities, and there's, I think, possibly also a question from a care worker as well, so that's really great. So I'll definitely be coming to those. Feel free to organise your questions under those buckets, but also feel free not to. So just briefly on the problems, I'll probably only do this for 5 minutes, because I don't think anyone particularly needs convincing that there are workforce issues to be resolved. But Charlie, what struck you the most about kind of the problem statement here when you were doing your work?
Yes, I think the thing that probably unsurprisingly really stood out, but for so many different ways, was pay. I mean, it's obviously called a fair pay agreement, but for so many different reasons. I mean, I showed the chart on the big wedge in terms of satisfaction with pay for care workers compared to other low-paid staff, and this is despite the fact that we've seen a really fast rising minimum wage that's improved things at the bottom end of the pay distribution. There's, I guess, part of the answer is to do with the fact that there is a really flat pay structure within care. There's some really striking stats from Skills for Care that basically show a care worker with 5 or more years experience can only expect to earn around 7p more than a care worker with less than a year's experience, which is just like absolutely striking. And then also, as I talked about in the presentation, this is also the thing that seems to be really driving a lot of the recruitment and retention crisis in the sector, where care providers basically say better pay elsewhere is the thing that means people leave or don't stay.
I might just add to that. So Charlie mentioned minimum wage underpayment and showed a statistic of 21,000. But that's people in the ONS's employer survey, where employers are asked what hourly rate do you pay your workers. We've sort of looked at the past. I think the problem is potentially much bigger than that, because as Gavin alluded to, I don't think that takes account of the time that domiciliary care workers spend travelling. So you legally have to be paid for travel time, or at least when HMRC adds up the hours that you've worked and does the calculation, they have to take that into account. But so, in theory, it could be legal. The situation could be okay if care workers were paid a high enough hourly wage rate for their contact time, such that when you add on this time travelling, the average rate sort of drops down a bit. But in practice, the contact time is only paid slightly above the minimum wage, and these workers spend about a fifth of their time travelling. So to me, it just looks blindly obvious that you've got a really large problem of minimum wage underpayment that needs to be dealt with. Gavin, on the state of the sector, so I did some work 2 years ago, and the basic impression I got was that this was in a sense, a workforce dealing with trauma. You know, they'd just been through COVID, experienced huge numbers of deaths in the sector, you know, really stressful time. Then they had a vacancies crisis. So on top of that, they had this massive stress of being overworked, trying to, you know, 2 people doing the work of 3. And then since then, we've now had a migration wave that's brought vacancies down. But, you know, this is really a sector going through huge, you know, hugely turbulent period. So what's the sort of state of morale for workers in the sector at the moment?
Well, I think it's still very low because none of the fundamentals have yet been fixed. This fair pay agreement is an exciting opportunity, but it obviously hasn't been delivered yet. So from the point of view of somebody who's working on the front line in social care, you haven't seen any change really, apart from rises in national minimum wage level. You know, you're not seeing any improvements, and actually because we still have this continued problem of acute underfunding, the end point of that is still going to be the driving down of terms and conditions of care workers. I'm going to keep coming back to this issue of travel time because I think it's really, really important. And just to emphasise, I'm not exaggerating the scale of the problem. I mean, Nai's done a huge amount of research on this as well. This is widespread. It is almost the norm not to be paid properly for your travel time as a domiciliary care worker in this country. That is a scandal hiding in plain sight. Everybody knows it's happening, and the only people that are suffering are people who are receiving care and the people who are providing care as care workers, who, you know, that example of somebody working 14 hours and only getting paid 8 hours at minimum wage. That's a real example, right? And that is repeated over and over and over again. And so you've used the word trauma. I think that is traumatic for somebody and their family. You're simply not going to be able to deal with all of the costs that you have in life if that's the situation that you find yourself in. And it's totally unacceptable. You know, I've heard people talk about, you know, care is a rewarding career, and emotionally, intellectually, it is. You know, a lot of care workers say that this is, you know, I actually get a huge amount from doing this because I'm well suited to this work. I like doing it, but that kind of rewarding doesn't pay the bills, and it doesn't put food on the table for your family. And when those two things come into conflict, in the end, people will go to another sector which they find less rewarding in an intellectually emotional way, but does put money in their bank account so that they can put food on the table for their family and pay their bills.
Okay, thanks. All right, so I suggest we now move on to some of these detailed questions about how it's going to work. So could we start, Angelica, by bringing up the Slido poll question, which is really meant to invite you to reflect on how optimistic you are for the prospects for getting this off the ground. So the question is, by the end of the Parliament, how many fair pay agreements will we have? And I think we meant in the UK, but it was pointed out to me earlier that we might have wanted to be slightly more specific, but let's just say in the UK. And the options you have are 0, 1, or more than 1. So 0 means you think that the social care fair pay agreement is not going to get off the ground. 1 means you think it will. And more than 1 means you think that this is really successful and we managed to expand the model into other sectors. So have that in the back of your minds as we do this discussion, and we'll bring up the answers in about 15 minutes. So in terms of getting this off the ground, Neha, you might say that, so we've got, you know, various countries in the world where sectoral collective bargaining is just the norm. That's just how it works. The UK isn't really one of those. We did have some structures, wage councils that existed up until the 80s, but they weren't quite the same as the kind of Scandinavian idea of, you know, employers and unions semi-voluntarily just sitting down to agree standards. The New Zealand is more in the UK tradition of, you know, setting some minimum universal standards. Is that why it failed? Just that it's just not part of the sort of DNA of the country to have these structures in place?
So I think that is part of the answer. So just like the UK, the decline of sectoral bargaining meant that just the system wasn't that mature. And I think that was like the key difference with screen workers. There was actually quite a mature system that could be hooked into to develop a much more targeted model of collective bargaining in that sector. But yeah, low rates of unionisation and especially just the big question in New Zealand was also who would represent employers, who would represent workers, and because because the model was actually not targeted to specific sectors but meant to be in a kind of overall framework. There were lots of design questions around who would be the employer of last resort if employers, for example, didn't have any incentive to find a collective voice. So in the New Zealand system, they did actually design a kind of a credible threat, which was the Employment Relations Authority, a tribunal, could step in and make a determination if one, employers didn't kind of one, find a collective voice in the first place and come to the table, or two, didn't even kind of ratify an agreement. So what I do understand that before it did get repealed, that credible threat did act as a real good incentive for employers to actually kind of come to the table in the few sectors where bargaining had been initiated, which was, I think, bus drivers, supermarket workers, and a few other sectors. So I think that's part of it. It's not part of the tradition. There's a lot further to go. But I would also come back to what I said at the start, was that it was just simply very ambitious and kind of and all-encompassing. So the big argument from kind of the ministers at the time and why they wanted a fair pay agreement was that their diagnosis was that there was a race to the bottom in lots of different sectors in terms of pay and conditions. Officials argued that actually that diagnosis maybe was potentially a bit inflated. Kind of, there wasn't lots of evidence that it was as widespread. There was definitely pockets of very bad practice. There was also, like the UK, strong challenges around kind of enforcement, and as I said at the start, kind of migrant exploitation. Like there were a lot of kind of labour market issues, but they weren't probably as widespread as kind of the government at the time was claiming, and that is what really, I think, flamed opposition to this from employers, because they saw FPAs along with the other many things the government was trying to do in the labour market. It's just a bit too much, and they just didn't fundamentally agree that there was a problem to be fixed.
Okay, thank you very much. People in the audience, I'm going to ask one more question based on that Slido question, but if you have any questions about the detail of all this, please do ask them in a second, so that there's your kind of 2-minute warning. So there's a few questions on Slido, and I've just highlighted one, Angelica, sort of say, will local authorities being involved in negotiations? And I think sort of who is at this table does seem to be one of the most important questions, because I suppose a really unfair characterization might be, ultimately the government is kind of deciding how much money is available in this system as a whole, maybe brackets with the sort of end users, those who are actually paying for their services as well, taking that decision. But you're kind of putting into a negotiating room people who don't really have that big picture choice about, how much money is going to workers at the end of the day versus how much are people paying for their care and how much are local authorities paying for that. So, Gavin, what do you think about that? Do we have the right people in the room to, in the end, in a kind of a big picture way, solve the problems? We've said these are really big problems, but you've just said, 500 million going in isn't going to change things very much. So should the government be in this room? Should they be at the table? Should unions, in a sense, and providers be able to say to government, we're happy to sort of work on some of these details, but really, we need to point the finger at you to raise overall funding levels.
Yeah, well, there's a distinction to be made between who is in the room, quote unquote, and who is a voting member of the adult social care negotiating body. They're two different things, and I think I am sure that during these negotiations there will be people in the room who may have some sort of observer status, or there may be different forms that it may take, but and that would include government and local government, I'm sure. But we're really clear from a kind of trade union perspective that when you're talking about national sectoral collective bargaining, it needs to be a negotiation between trade unions and employers, not some sort of tripartite model. It needs to be, and so it is really important that the views of local authorities are taken into account, because they do have an important strategic position. But it is simply unworkable to have a kind of tripartite model, and we do want it to be a negotiation between employers and trade unions. And so I think that's where how it works. We need to work through some of the detail of that. That's part of the consultation at the moment. Who will actually be in the room? That's I think local authorities may well be one of those people, and government as well. But in terms of who's got voting rights on the body, it should be employers and trade unions.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I may have been watching too much Hamilton. There's about a 10-minute song about were you in the room when it happened. But yes, as you said, maybe that's not the only thing that matters. Joyce, the sector is comprised of, actually I don't have the number, but a lot of different providers, big ones, small ones, and I think there's a fair amount of churn within the sector as well, providers starting, closing, growing, shrinking. So how can the sector possibly speak with one voice? Surely what some small providers want is quite different from what some of the bigger sort of institutional providers might be interested in.
Yes, as you said, the sector is very diverse with the number of providers and in fact the different makeup of providers, whether you're corporate, whether you've got a single home with your domiciliary care with just one area that you look after, or whether you've got many areas. And then of course you go through the sectors of learning disabilities, all of the sectors that are involved in social care and all of the age groups. So it is very diverse. So how do you approach the fair pay negotiations with the sector? To me, of course, the best way is to negotiate with the trade association that we have, the overarching one. There's something called the Care Providers Alliance, which is a voice for 11 different trade associations, and they cover all of the different sectors. So to have the CPA or various trade associations and the sectors that they represent at the negotiating table would definitely be of advantage to discussing the procedures and how to go forwards.
Okay, thank you. All right, does anyone have any questions in the room? I've got more questions and I've got online questions, but I would like to give the people in the room who made the effort to come, for which we're very grateful. Any thoughts in particular about kind of the detail here? Yes, please do go for it. Thank you.
Thanks so much. That was really interesting, and I'm one of the policy leads that's actually working on the fair pay agreement, so definitely some food for thought there. I just had a question for Charlie, because one of your recommendations was around potentially including self-employed workers later down the line. I wondered if you had any thought on how that might actually work in practice, because I agree with you that it kind of feels at odds with setting pay and conditions for those who kind of set their own. So keen to hear how you think that could happen.
Mm-hmm. Great. Any other questions while we give Charlie 20 seconds to collect his thoughts? There is a huge amount of detail to be resolved here, so I can't imagine everyone in the room knows everything about the detail, doesn't have more questions. But okay, while Charlie thinks, I'll just mention another question that I thought was quite interesting. Well, we did have that question also online about self-employed. So maybe we'll start there. Charlie, do you have any thoughts about how that could work in practice?
Yeah, so I guess where we sort of arrived here was, obviously starting with the, might be a bit odd to tell them to pay themselves a bit more, but there are things like health and safety that would be covered by self-employed workers. So further down the line, if things like health and safety did fall within a fair pay agreement, I think, maybe if we'd been having this conversation during the COVID pandemic, we probably would have been saying absolutely it should be within there. I think the other reason why we thought maybe self-employed a bit further down the line is this sort of idea of bogus self-employment, where people are misclassified as self-employed, and we sort of run the numbers, and the share that are potentially self-employed, where they actually look a bit more like employees in the sector, is quite high. So I think that was another reason, not necessarily for the fair pay agreement to resolve that misclassification, but just that it needs to be flagged sort of further down the line.
Okay, thank you, Charlie. Does anyone else have any thoughts? Have you
So I would, as I said, I was the lucky individual who got tasked with, can you figure this thing out for contractors, because we can't figure it out in this space, and we went through that same exercise. I think that point around misclassification is an important one, and ultimately where we landed was the solution is therefore not to try and strengthen all the kind of legal protections for a group that's actually misclassified, but you actually need better enforcement capacity in the first place. So if it's bogus self-employment, I think that's where I would argue that actually this is about a labour market enforcement kind of issue. Ultimately, I think just to kind of highlight again, like I completely agree with the principle of including or extending later to self-employed workers, given kind of how diverse this workforce is. But I would kind of go back to what I said at the start, which is then you have to be really careful about how you design the system now and ensure there are some kind of, and I don't know exactly, unfortunately, what that flexibility looks like, and probably put you in touch with my New Zealand colleagues. But they obviously got to the stage that they had developed a very specific system that they've said would ultimately have to be unwound if you try to bring in self-employed people at a later stage. So I think it's important not to kind of promise something that might not be able to be delivered as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I'm interested in this question about pay. So a big message from Charlie, Hannah and Mel's report is that sort of moving quickly sort of matters. While there's sort of the political space for this to happen, you need to go because the political space might not be there for very long. But that presumably brings about challenges, because I was really struck that you mentioned that New Zealand didn't quite get there because the political moment changed, but they had been working on it for 5 years in the run-up to introducing it, and that hasn't really been the case here. You could say that it's been part of Labour's plans, but I wouldn't say there have been sort of active work happening on it for much more than the life of this Parliament. Is that fair? So so we are talking about quite a challenging sort of rate of sort of work here, and then again drawing a comparison to the Low Pay Commission. So that was introduced quite quickly by New Labour. So New Labour came in 97. The legislation passed in 98 and the minimum wage was in place by 99. So that sounds like they're working really quickly. But again, that was building on at least a decade of sort of arguments between unions and business about minimum wages, and kind of by the time Labour came in, there was already this basic agreement that it was a good idea. So the kind of the sort of shared working was already in place. So Gavin, you've been involved in this process. How does it feel? Do you feel like you're working quickly, appropriately quickly?
Yeah.
And sorry, a sub question. Could you remind us what the timetable is for this happening and being implemented?
Yeah. So on that final point, we want to see the government has set out a timescale for the first deal to be delivered in 2028, and we would want to see it done more quickly than that. But the case has been made by government that the number of hoops that need to be jumped through in order to get to that point is so. Kind of reluctantly, we're accepting that as the time scale that's been put in place. It does put a lot of pressure on the first set of negotiations in order to deliver initially. Remind me your original question. No, sorry, I didn't write it down.
Are you working quickly enough?
Yeah.
Can this happen?
Yeah. So no, I think it can, because obviously a lot of people won't have been aware of this, but there was discussions pre-election about how this might be delivered, and then of course post-election and discussions between unions, the Labour Party, and unions and employers as well. So there was it was in the manifesto. People knew this was coming, so we were kind of ready when that happened. And I've said it before, but that once the civil service gets hold of something and is told to deliver it, they do it, and it has been well resourced, and we have had a very structured process over the last year in order to produce the public consultation. So I've had a sense over the last year that perhaps people who weren't involved in that process might not have had of momentum towards this, and so it does feel like we're moving in the right direction from that point of view. Doesn't mean there's lots of difficulties along the way from here until doing that first deal, but I think I've sitting here now, I am optimistic about the delivery of it, because I know the level of detail that government has gone into in order to try and shake out those possible problems.
That's really encouraging, and I'm told that most of our online audience is from the Department of Health and Social Care, so a nice spring in your step there as you head into Christmas. Angelica, could we bring up the results of our poll? So the question was, by the end of the Parliament, how many fair pay agreements will we have? And I might just ask the panel to see whether they agree with this. So we have more than half of our audience saying that 1. So that is what the government is currently planning. So the audience thinks the government will deliver it. Maybe that's good to hear that civil servants think they will deliver what they've been asked to deliver. Does anyone have any... it's nudging around. That's great. Does anyone have any dissenting views from 1? Joyce, what do you think? Do you think it's going to happen?
I would think 1. I would think more than 1 is slightly too ambitious. for this, because it's still really to get off the ground and the scoping and the terms of reference, isn't it? So I would hope for one.
Okay. Charlie, what about you? So you mentioned that you think there are other sectors which would be candidates for an FPA. So do you want to make the case that we should be being bolder with our institutional reform?
Yeah, I think I'm going to be optimistic. I'm going to say 3 in one and another.
3.
Another in warehousing and cleaning, where there are sort of like very clear and acute labour market problems. I kind of think that those conversations, I mean, it might feel a bit early now, but they should probably be going on in parallel with the setup of the fair pay agreement in adult social care.
Okay, good stuff. Anyone else, or Neha, do you think? What do you think?
I think 1.
You think 1?
Yeah.
I've got a suggestion for
Okay.
another sector that might be considered. This is outside of my remit, so I'm taking a risk here with my Unison colleagues. But I do think the housing association sector is an interesting example. Has its own kind of legislative background. It's clearly identifiable. Has a strong relationship with the public sector, and does have some issues with pay and terms and conditions as well. So that's maybe one other to consider as well. And we shouldn't forget, by the way, that there will also be fair pay agreements in Scotland and Wales as well. So at least 3 would be my...
Okay, well, thank you for that. Now, I was just about to bring up a Slido question on that. So if we could bring down the poll, and I can put up this question. So I think I probably should have been more careful in this discussion so far to be clear about what we're talking about in terms of coverage. So who would like to explain how care and devolution works in the UK and how Wales and Scotland fit into this? Who wants to put that in? Gavin?
Well, now this is you've given me a risky question here. So I am the lead on social care for Unison, and I'm leading it on the FPA in England only, and I have colleagues in Scotland and Wales who are leading on that process themselves. So that they are going through their own consultation processes at the moment, which are kind of some of which mirrors what is happening in England, but there are other elements to it as well. I think it's really important to say that they're not starting from the same place as we did in England. They both in Scotland and Wales, they had developed forms of national pay bargaining in social care, albeit not backed up by any kind of statutory framework. And so the practice of getting employers and trade unions and sometimes government in the room in Scotland and Wales has been much more established. They're kind of ahead of the game in Scotland and Wales. So to some extent, the way that the fair pay agreement process will land will to a large extent depend on how much of what they've previously already developed is going to be taken into the new process. So that's why this is not going to be uniform across the UK. It won't be exactly the same as in England, Scotland and Wales. There will be important differences as well. So, I can't detail all of those differences right now, but I think it's really important to recognise that we didn't all start in the same place on social care pay negotiations.
Okay, so we have some sort of warning flags to look out for from New Zealand, but some sort of positives to take from how this is already working in other parts of the UK. That's encouraging. Okay, we've got 5 minutes left. So I was going to move on to our final question, really. Does anyone have any last questions in the room about any of the detail on this? Yes, please do, go for it. Oh, we've got 2. Well done.
Hi, thanks for that. I'm Emma. I'm also from the Department of Health. I was going to ask about the negotiating body, and what do you think about the ideal size of the negotiating body in a way that balances representing a very diverse sector versus being pragmatic in reaching consensus? And related to that, what kind of evidence do you think they should consider in the negotiations?
Okay. Back to who's in the room. Or is that about who's in the room, or are we also talking about non-room participants? But who's in the room? Okay, we're on who's in the room. And yes, sir.
Hi there. I'm from ACAS, who we're slated to be the dispute resolution body for this. This is it's a negotiation challenge, but then it's going to be a huge implementation challenge of essentially contract change across a whole sector, putting the agreement into practice in a sector that doesn't have a huge experience of collective bargaining and HR practices, perhaps more broadly. I wondered how the panel see supporting implementation going and how that can be supported.
Okay, thank you very much. So what role for ACAS in supporting this process? Who would like to take on either of those questions? How many people should be in the room, and how can existing structures like ACAS? Joyce?
Yes, well, of course, we would like to see as many people involved as possible, but it isn't always possible in a consultation. Yeah, indeed, ACAS and the other sector that might not be approached, of course, is employees who don't belong to a union. You've already mentioned that there are a large proportion of the social care workforce do not belong to a union, so they have a voice as well. Who would represent them? I quite agree. It would be very difficult to work on that one. But yes, the local authorities, NHS or commissioning bodies, the unions, I would like to see ACAS and, of course, non-union employee representatives.
Okay. Now, any lessons from New Zealand on how big to make this body?
It's because they never even got that far. Probably do, yeah.
Okay, fair enough. And so I was maybe slightly harsh on the existence of bargaining structures. ACAS obviously a really important part of the framework in the UK, helping workers and employers talk to one another. So Gavin, can you see a role for ACAS in making all of this work once it's been put in place?
Yeah, I think there will be undoubtedly be an important role for ACAS. I mean, you mentioned the point about there being limited experience of collective bargaining. I guess the best way to get experience is to do it, right? And that's kind of what's starting to happen through the discussions we're having with employers at the moment. Just wanted to, if I might, Nye, just push back a little bit on that point about non-unionised workers being represented. Whatever solution that people might come up with, that would be like a representative body of people who work in the sector. Now, the only people who can effectively represent people is if there's an action to kind of be a member of an organisation. And trade union membership in the social care sector, it's been mentioned a couple of times, is low. And, when compared to other public services, that is true. But it's also a rapidly growing membership in the social care sector. Given the barriers that have been put in front of trade unions, it's kind of incredible how high union membership is in the social care sector. We're routinely denied access to the workforce, and employers will just sit on their hands and not allow us access or to talk to people. And also, we haven't previously had the opportunity to say to the social care workforce, we are negotiating your pay. And finally, just to remove the incentive to join a trade union by saying, well, you don't need to join a trade union. There'll just be some other body that's probably been set up by employers. You can just sort of, feed in through that. But that would remove any incentivization for unionisation as well. And finally, in all our other public services, workers are represented only by trade unions. They're not represented by anybody else. What is it about the social care sector that means people think it's a lower status, that they shouldn't have unions representing them? I think it's really important to push back on that. So I see the Fair Pay Agreement as well as delivering better pay for workers, also delivering unionisation for a sector that desperately needs it.
Okay, thank you very much. So we are up against our time, so we will probably not do the last navel-gazing big picture segment, but mainly the point I wanted to draw out there is that this is a new institution doing a very new thing in the UK, but also operating within constraints in terms of the overall funding envelope that has been set for it by government, and there are also very big other labour market changes being pushed through at the same time with the Employment Rights Bill. So I think we should probably all be a bit careful not to put too many expectations on this new institution to achieve too much in its initial years. As the paper says, we should first of all just try to get it off the ground, and achieving some change would be, I think, a mark of success. So sorry not to give the panellists a final word, but as Charlie says, we need to move quickly, so we shouldn't spend any more time than we need to in a basement in Resolution Foundation. So let's say thank you to all of our panellists. And thank you all very much for coming. We'll leave it there. Thank you.